Balicka-Witakowska. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a great pleasure for me to have you here with us at the Martin-Luther-Universität in Halle an der Saale. You are a guest at the moment, conducting research on art historical questions in the larger realm of Christian Oriental studies. And I'm very interested to learn a little bit about you and how you came to be an art historian and a specialist in Christian Oriental art. May I ask you, maybe first of all, to say a little bit about where your institutional home is? I know that you work in Uppsala, in Sweden, at Uppsala University, but
yes.
You have some more details that you can share.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this institute, Professor Horn, and the special institute covering the area of research which are so important for me and so unusual generally. Well, if I want to say something about my affiliation, so indeed I'm retired but still connected to the university in Uppsala, to the Institute of Philology and Linguistics, which is a general title for institute covering the Oriental languages and classical languages. And I'm still there because I'm running a couple of projects which are supported by this institute.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so your affiliation is then in fact with a philological and text-oriented department.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know about your work as an art historian, so this is very interesting that art history and philology can go together in this instance at that university.
Yeah, the history behind this affiliation is such that at the beginning I was connected to the Byzantine studies, which were connected to the classical languages, but it was some 15 years ago, and after this some period, everything was covered by one institution, and which gather the Oriental languages and the classical languages, and Byzantine studies as well.
So Byzantine studies was the initial moment that connected you with that
exactly,
institution.
Yes.
Would you say you are, in the beginnings, a historian of Byzantine culture and Byzantine art, or would you maybe share with me a little bit about how you came to be who you are and what steps you went through?
As a matter of fact, I started my education as a Semitist at Warsaw University, and with the main subject classical Hebrew. And I wrote my master thesis in classical Hebrew, but at the same time I started to study art history. And I wrote my master thesis in art history as well, but this time I concentrated on something different, namely Ethiopian art. And then, it was decided that I will do my PhD in Institute of Art History, and I will continue to develop my interest in Ethiopian art. So it was a subject for my PhD. But I moved to Sweden from Poland in 1979, and there I joined the Institute of Art History with keeping the same subject for my research. But it was not so easy because this kind of competence in Sweden is not existing, and so I could get help from France, and I joined Centre des études supérieures de civilisation médiévale in Poitiers. So, as a matter of fact, my PhD was partly done in Uppsala University and partly in Poitiers.
Oh wow, that's quite international and across country boundaries that you have worked there, disciplinary boundaries and regional and country boundaries.
Yeah.
So you are a trained Semitist in Hebrew philology and a trained art historian in Byzantine-related matters.
Semitist, but not only Hebrew, because in Warsaw the students were obliged to study 3 Semitic languages. So for me it was classical Hebrew, classical Ethiopic, and Arabic.
Oh, okay, very good. And then your dissertation work was on art history in Ethiopic related materials.
Yeah, my dissertation was about a very particular subject, namely about a theological concept of crucifixion without Christ on the cross.
Oh, okay.
So this kind of representation are known from the early Christian art, and then they disappeared, but they were preserved in Ethiopia when they appeared in 13th century. So the gap between the early Christian object and Ethiopian objects were quite large. And my task was to explain what happened, how this very particular concept developed, and why it was abandoned and then appeared in another kind, in another end of the Christian world, so to say.
Mm-hmm. So a theological question, or a question about a key figure in theological texts, Jesus on the cross, obviously, not on the cross in the art, was part of what you explored in terms of how it is expressed in the art, in the material objects that you investigated. Very interesting. You conducted further research and have worked on further topics, some of which, as far as I know, have to do with Ethiopic art. Would you like to talk a little bit about other research interests you have pursued in the course of your career?
The start point was, of course, my PhD, because I couldn't just deal with Ethiopian art, which was on the very end of this development chain. So I was forced to study early Christian art and, of course, the text relevant to this area of art. So I start to develop my interest in Byzantine art and in Oriental Christian art, and of course about literature from this area and generally the culture. It turned out that besides the Byzance, I have to take in consideration Syria, Coptic Egypt, Nubia, and even sometimes Armenia.
Okay. So you have worked on some subsets of art in the Armenian realm, in the Syriac realm, in the Coptic realm.
Yeah.
What have you worked on with regards to the Syriac artistic tradition? Do you have a specific example?
Well, I was always interested in manuscripts. It was a question to explore the Syrian miniatures and Syrian manuscripts and their connection with Armenian art and with Byzantine art, and on the iconographical level even with Ethiopian art.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, since I concentrated my research on Ethiopia mostly, so I developed my interest towards Coptic Egypt, because the Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian art is always connected closely to Coptic area, and in some way developed in very close connection to Coptic Egypt because of the contacts between the Ethiopian and Coptic Church.
Yeah, okay, that is a very important connection between Egypt and Ethiopia. So am I to assume that you spent most of your time researching in Egypt, in Cairo, in the museums, or you went to Syria and worked in some of the major collections there. How do you go about doing your work?
Well, as a matter of fact, it was not so much the collections in the museums, rather the places difficult accessible, especially in Coptic Egypt and in Ethiopia, because there are not so many objects of interest in the museums, rather they are dispersed in the churches and in the monasteries. So my task was to travel from one place to another and at the first stage to record of these art objects, to photograph them and to describe. And for that I could develop very important database because I photographed all these objects. And then, together with my colleague in Canada, Professor Michael Gervais, we organized a database for all these photographs. It's called Mezgebe Silat, the Treasury of Images. And for the moment, it gathers some 100,000 pictures from first Ethiopia, then Coptic Egypt, but also from Nubia, some are from Syria, and all of them are in open access, so everybody can enter the database and take the material for further research.
Well, that sounds like a real treasure trove that you have established there. So I understand this correctly, that it's very important for you to conduct field work and go to many different sites where art objects are located that haven't been professionally recorded, because the material is, as you say, not in the museums.
No.
Or it's not accessible in the collections. Maybe there's more than what is on display, but not much of the Christian art is yet accessible in museums.
Exactly. So my task was in fact to organize the expeditions, because it's not like to go to the place and where you have all the object in display. You have to travel very far, and sometimes it's very difficult because there are no connection. You have to walk, you have to carry all your equipment, and equipment is heavy because it's not just food, it's water, it's cameras, and since in the most of these places there are no electricity, so you have to carry generator and you have to carry the fuel to fill the generator. So if you are, for instance, organizing such an expedition for 1 month, so of course, and camping equipment as well, and you cannot count the locals will provide you with food. So everything have to be very carefully organized. It was one moment which gave me some hope to facilitate my efforts when the solar panels were introduced, but unfortunately, even in Ethiopia, they are not working well. They charge very slowly. So if you want to use them, you have to stay very, very long time, which is not possible of other reasons. So still this very primitive approach to the equipment have to be kept, means you carry a generator and you carry fuel, which is of course quite complicated, and food for your team.
How large is your team? I mean, if you go for a month and you have to carry all these cameras, all these generators, the food, the tent and everything.
Of course, I try to minimize the team, but usually I have 2 photographs, because one is not able to work all the time, and I used to bring with me a conservator, because it's I always need advice how to approach the art object. It's not obvious that everything can be photographed. Some are in quite bad conditions. They could be preserved but not photographed. First, they need some conservation, and Since I'm not conservator, I need the conservator advice all the time. And then, of course, well, I have the locals who can help with transport, but, well, it's quite complicated generally.
Okay, so you have a team of 4 or 5 people, including yourself, of professionals in the art-related industry, and then for the more mundane tasks.
What is important to point in connection to this expeditions that since 1995, when the digital cameras were introduced, it was much easier, because before we produced the slides.
Okay.
But then when digital cameras became popular, we could photograph a lot. And on this basis, we start to photograph the full collection of the manuscripts. For instance, we went to one monastery and we took everything. And then we preserved this material on hard disks, and then we try to make this material accessible for everybody.
Okay, so you have quite extensive photos and slides or related images of the collections that you have visited, where you have been able to gain access to the materials.
Yes, but it's different things for the art objects, which can be photographed without not very high resolution and be acceptable, but another thing is to digitize the manuscripts, which now there are special requirements how they should be digitized, and of course for this material one needs a special place to preserve them.
You mean on site? Or
no? Every site used to get the material on in hard disk.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but independently, we need the server who can manage this amount of pictures and then
the
make
storage
it
for the
and maintain this database. Recently I worked with the British Library, which provide me with this kind of server, and it's their task to make it accessible.
Okay. Oh, good. This is for the product that you create. When you have the images, you have to have set up a network and then reliable partners where you can store the material that you have photographed and that you have recorded in some way. Then you mentioned a conservator, a specialist in conservation that comes with you along on those journeys. I'm curious to ask about, is real conservation work possible on the site that can be done on a manuscript, or is it primarily about how to properly and carefully treat the object so that the recording of the images can take place?
Well, the proper conservation is not possible because for that you need a laboratory with a lot of equipment, which is not possible to bring with us. But we called this first step the preservation. So, for instance, in the case of manuscript, they can be cleaned a bit, they can be put in the special boxes, they can be labeled, and then we can explain for the owners, which are usually the priests, monks, how to deal with them and how to preserve them. Okay. So it's part of our job as well. But for the conservation, you need the laboratory, and usually you have to take the object to the laboratory, and these possibilities are usually not possible.
Yeah. Okay, but nevertheless, the local owners of the art objects get some benefit from your visit in the form of a preliminary conservation or preservation of the material, because you provide some boxes, provide some labeling, get some first steps, and maybe also help develop some awareness that more could be done, or maybe also should be done, to make possible that these art objects will not deteriorate but will be lasting for a much longer time.
And if we are working in the place which are better developed, so it's a kind of inspiration we can give these places. For instance, my project was in Jerusalem, in the St. Xavier Monastery, Franciscan Monastery, where my team digitized the whole collection of manuscripts. It's a huge collection in 18 languages and from
in 18 languages,
and from 12th century to 20th century, and it's some 1,500 pictures. And at that occasion we discovered that the collection is not kept in the proper way. We discovered some insects, we discovered some very serious damages, because the manuscripts in this collection were collected from the other monasteries in the Holy Land, which are not working anymore. And then this library were not kept in the proper way. So all these manuscripts were sent to St. Xavier, and of course, if they were contaminated, so they contaminated the whole collection. And now the director decided to organize the laboratory for the conservator, and even in cooperation with the University in Jerusalem to provide some special machine for to kill all the insects which we discovered in the books. So it's a kind of cleaning of the whole collection, plus the new laboratory for this particular.
So some serious steps are being taken in order to ensure longer preservation and long-term sustainability of this material. Very, very exciting. So I understand correctly, you collect first of all and mostly material related to manuscripts and illuminated manuscripts, or
how
would you describe
since now there is a tendency to digitize the collections of manuscripts in the main project are concentrated on this particular area. So I'm doing that because it's a requirement, but at the same time I take in consideration the other art objects, small art objects, because I'm not able to do something for the wall paintings, which need very much attention and conservation, but it's another kind of project which for the moment is not possible.
Okay, so you and your team are not equipped or not specialized on this particular area, that preservation documentation of wall paintings, for example,
it's very expensive and needs a lot of preparations and a lot of money, and so I couldn't manage this kind of project, although it would be good to start think towards this idea.
Okay. What would be the smaller objects that you said, besides the manuscripts, that you can document?
There are painting on wood.
Also paintings, but on smaller
sometimes
materials.
Called icons, although they are not icons. So it's diptychs, triptychs, and panels. There are crosses. There are liturgical vessels. Sometimes there are textiles. Everything which has something to do with the church activities and religion, because usually my projects are connected to this area, to what the religiosity produced, and which was connected to churches, monasteries, or other religious communities.
Okay, so the focus on religious life is very significant.
Because I'm mostly dealing with the Christian Oriental area, so it's of course this kind of material I have to deal with.
I wonder to what extent you might also be able to go and visit, let's say, grave sites and document rituals or ways of decorating slabs, or maybe burial places, for example. Is that something that is? I mean, this would be a place where religious art and normal aspects of normal everyday life at particular moments intersect, that are not necessarily in a church space where they take place.
Well, if I'm thinking about Coptic Egypt and Ethiopia, so it's not much to study, because there are different rituals, funeral rituals. The people wish to be buried close to the church, but anonymely. Okay. So these graveyards with graves and with the inscriptions are something totally new. Mm-hmm. But usually there are no graveyards. There are places where they put the bodies and leave them there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so no further documentation sites. Very interesting. You have some other research projects that you work on. I mean, the digitization and the recording, that's part of the work you do, but you investigate also the content of some of the manuscripts and some of the illuminations, some of the motifs that are in your dissertation. You looked at cross depictions or the depictions of the crucifixion in some ways. What would be some other topics that you investigate in your work?
Well, my main interest was always iconography, which cannot be studied without knowledge of the texts. Mm-hmm. So I always try to connect the text with the images, and it's not necessarily in the manuscripts. Of course, if I'm studying the manuscripts, so the special approach is needed. I have to connect the text and the image and to find out the method how they are connected. But I am looking if I'm looking for some motifs on the wall paintings, so this connection is not so close. But still, I always need to look to the texts. So my work is to study the text and make connections between the text and the pictures, and explain why the pictures were composed in that or other way. But
do you start from the pictures and then see which texts they illustrate and read this way, or do you sometimes also start from a text and then see what range of pictures go with it?
I suppose that both ways are appropriated, because sometimes I'm reading the text and connect them with the picture directly, or I'm looking at the picture and find something unusual and try to find the text which could explain this unusual addition.
So you don't have a preferred trajectory to follow? It depends on whatever the material is that is available
of the material. My recent project is about the very particular texts called the Miracles of Mary.
The Miracles of Mary? Oh, okay.
The Miracles of the Virgin Mary. And it's texts extremely interesting, because it's not just one text. There are collections of texts which originally were created in France and Spain, and then from this place in the early Middle Ages, let's see, in the 12th and 13th century, and from there they spread through the whole Europe and also to the Christian Orient. And what is what is my main interest in pursuing this project, to find the connection between all these texts, how they traveled, how they are connected, from where some motifs were taken. The focus is, of course, on the Latin and French text, because they were the first text composed.
Oh, so that's the origins of this
but
text
then
material.
They traveled, and then they were developed according to the local needs, and it's interesting to know how they developed. And for instance, what I can find very peculiar, that some motifs from Old Swedish are the same as Ethiopian.
Okay. So you have
of course, I cannot say that there are contacts between this part of the world, but some way they traveled so long.
Okay, so far.
And then, it's one part of the project, and another it's about the pictures, because all these texts were illustrated. So it's interesting to find out how they were illustrated, and how much of this text were illustrated, and what caught attention of the painters, and inspired them to produce the pictures.
Now, you said this is a collection of miracles of Mary. So this is Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. I wondered to what extent images that go along with the text might give some windows, or might open up some windows onto lives of women in different parts, to which the different parts in the European area, or maybe also in the Middle Eastern area, to which these texts traveled. Do you think there is an opportunity that this text is a source, or this text and the images is a source for studying women history?
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the possibilities, because several miracles concern women and their problems, and so it could be picked up and studied separately.
So this is work that hasn't been done yet?
No, it was never done, and should be done, of course, but if we start to categorize the miracles, we can find the areas not only for this gender studies, but also the other type of approach to this text.
What would you suggest would be some other approaches to take to this material?
For instance, development of the text in connection to particular place which had particular needs. For instance, if we take one place where some kind of disease developed, so we can expect that several miracles connected to this phenomenon will be produced.
Okay.
The best example is the collection of Ethiopian miracles of Mary, where we find Mary healing from AIDS.
Okay. So there would be some real insights into medical history that could be gained from studying this material, both in its textual and in its pictorial expressions.
Yeah, the healing is one category, but there are also the other categories which should be taken in consideration. What kind of help people expect from the Virgin Mary, who always act on behalf of the faithful, depending of the place, depending of the time, and depending of the situation.
Should I expect that Ethiopia is the main area in which these miracles were received? Because you mentioned that there is an Ethiopic collection of these miracles. Or would there be, specifically for the Near East, would there be some other areas to which these traditions traveled?
Well, I suppose that Ethiopia is very particular because the cult of Mary is developing there all the time, and the figure of the Virgin Mary is very important. And this collection of the miracles is growing. They are composed all the time.
You mean the modern time?
In the modern time. And they are added to the manuscripts, because the manuscripts are still produced according to the old tradition. And so this collection of Ethiopian miracles is huge. But I suppose that it's not the only the single place where such a situation we can observe. For instance, if we go to the places connected with the cult of Mary, like Lud, like Medjugorje, so probably we can find the same phenomenon.
Sure.
I'm sure that all the miracles which took place are noted, and it's it's another approach to this phenomenon, and connected to our life, to modern life.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a living tradition and a living and a further developing tradition. Very, very interesting. Do you have another project on which you're working? Or is this the main text of your work at the moment? It seems like it is a big one to begin with.
It's so big that I don't know how to manage it, because as a matter of fact, the miracles of Mary are noted in all languages. It's difficult to find a language which simply disregard these texts. So it's a question to organize this project in such a way that these connections between languages, between the tradition, will be manageable, which is not easy. But another project I have, it's more private. Since long ago, together with my French and Canadian and Polish colleagues, I am working on a big monograph about one very important church in Ethiopia called Christos. It's a site with one church decorated with paintings, and these paintings are not painted by the Ethiopians but by the Copts. So, which means that the connection between Coptic Egypt and Ethiopia in this particular place have to be studied carefully. And then the place is interesting because it's only one secular building, old building preserved there, the kind of palace of the king who became the saint in Ethiopian tradition.
Oh, a saint in the Ethiopian tradition.
So it's a huge project which we tried to manage last 10 years, and probably it will be finished perhaps next year.
Okay. So you have really big projects and very big projects too. I would assume you also have teams, not only concrete teams that go with you into the field, but networks of scholars that benefit from the material that you provide with your documentation for studying these larger projects.
Yeah, because I think that it's the most important thing now. It's to make all material accessible for the scholars, and particularly for the scholars who are not able to travel. And if this network is working in the proper way, so the development of the research is going in the proper way, and it's simply very important to share.
So that's probably also the rationale behind the open access available database that you have mentioned earlier, that is located at the Canadian site there, where the pictures are put down accessible for scholars to use.
Accessible for scholars without payment, free of charge,
okay.
Because as we know, the scholars are not very rich, and to charge for the microfilms or for pictures, it's not fair, I think.
Mm-hmm. But that also means that the projects you engage in depend on receiving financing from institutions or associations ahead of time, so that you can conduct the work, so that the products in the end don't have to pay for further projects.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's this difficult part of my activities, because I spend a lot of time on writing the project and then trying to promote them, and it needs a very, very large network, and I suppose that it's important to know a lot of specialists who can say something positive about the project which I present to the boards. And the boards usually respect the specialists' judgment. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's another part of the work to have the network and to write the projects.
Mm-hmm. You have so many different tasks that you fulfill with your activities and so many pressing needs. I don't even want to ask the next question I wanted to ask in some way, but what do you think is the most important work to be done with regard to Oriental Christian art? From your perspective, what do you think is the thing to focus on?
I suppose that the most important thing is to record the objects, the manuscript, because it's the only way we can preserve them. Some of them perhaps survives, but we know very well that the most of them will not survive. Okay. So, and the amount of this object diminished all the time. So what we have to do is to record, and record. We cannot count that the preservation and conservation will take place immediately. It needs a lot of money, as I said, and a lot of time. So what we can do is just to record and make it accessible.
Okay, so record and produce documentation of the material as it is accessible now.
Yeah,
because we don't know what's
searchable, which means which is another part of this project, because it's not enough to put the material online. It must be described, and description make this material searchable. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's not useful.
Ensure accessibility for the materials. I wish you good luck for your further endeavors with this big task. We don't have much time left. I wanted to thank you for the time you've taken to talk with me a little bit, and I do hope that maybe there's something we can do on our part to help support this important work. And I wanted to thank you for all your efforts that you contribute towards preserving the Christian Oriental heritage, which is so fundamental for the kinds of studies we're trying to do also here at the University in Halle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I hope that our cooperation will continue, and I'm sure that this Center for Studies can help me a lot with my project and with promotion of my projects.
That's my hope too. Thank you.
Thank you.